If you're a Nikon user who wants to save a bit of money but not sacrifice quality, then the Tamron range is for you. Now, Tamron are a third-party range of lenses, and they are of course cheaper than your standard first-party lenses, but they still do have a very comprehensive range of lenses, as you can see here. Now, when it comes to the Tamron range of lenses, a lot of people will note that they do feel fairly plasticky, and that's probably why they're such lightweight lenses comparative to their first-party lenses as a result. But don't let that necessarily deter you from these lenses, as they are still very well built. Each of these lenses does have a rubber gasket along the mount and various junction points along the lens, ensuring that no leakage is getting inside the lenses. You also, of course, do have a fluorine coating on the lens here that protects it from oil and water. So while these lenses do feel plasticky, that just means they're lightweight and they are still very much protected from your standard elements. So if you splash some water on here, it won't necessarily break it, but still wipe your lenses down and don't drop them. As for the diameter of these lenses, a majority of these lenses, with exception to two lenses here, the 150 to 500 and the 35 to 150, all these lenses do have 67mm diameters. So you also will save a bit of money on ND filters if you plan to invest in this range. Now, as for the range, they have released, as of this video, 6 lenses. Now, this range of lenses are fairly comprehensive. I do think they cover a very broad range of focal lengths, but Tamron's priority does appear to be the telephoto range. So it would be nice if they released a 11 to 20 zoom on the Z mount as well. But currently what we're working with here is primarily aimed at wildlife photography, portrait photography. So these are naturally going to be very long sort of lenses you're working with here. But comparative to the competitors, they are actually smaller lenses as well. And of course, because of their plastic material, they are lighter as a result. In all honesty though, these lenses are very comprehensive in their focal length. Some of them do drop below 50mm. So you do find a lot of lenses here are very much all-in-one lenses. So they can cover you for mid shots, landscapes, and of course, close-ups. But today is just going to be a quick overview of each of these lenses, just talking about what makes them special, but also a few of the shortcomings in each of them to keep in mind if you want to invest in the Tamron range. So let's get to it. All right, so first off, let's start with the sole prime lens of the range here, the 90mm macro. Now, for a long time, macro lenses weren't really hobbyist lenses. They were very much sort of technical document copying sort of lenses. Tamron in 1979 developed their own macro lens, which had bokeh and was an ideal lens for, well, portrait photography. And really, when you're getting a micro lens from Tamron, you're basically getting something that's 40 years in the making, and that's the 90mm macro right here. So what's special about this macro lens here is this is, of course, a macro lens, but it's also a telephoto lens, so you can get some good 90mm prime shots on this, good mid shots. But also it does have a continuous aperture of 2.8 as well as 1:1 magnification. So what you're getting there is true macro, provided of course you are using a full frame sensor. The aperture in this lens is also 12-bladed aperture, which is the most blades of any lens in this range. Most of these lenses cover 7 to 9-bladed aperture, but with a 90mm macro right here, you're getting 12 blades, which of course is very round, very beautiful. It's a good bit of separation for your subject, especially in macro photography. Now, in terms of autofocus, this lens will have what a lot of these lenses have, which is a VXD motor, which means that the motor is pretty damn fast as well as quiet. And of course, the E-mount variation of these lenses, because these are Z-mounts, the E-mount is going to be a little bit more faster than your standard Z-mounts, but it's still a very fast and responsive autofocus. And of course, when you pair this with a Nikon Z, such as the Z5 II or the Z9, and you combine that with the subject detection, you do get a very responsive autofocus. As for the build of this lens, or at least what makes it unique, it does come with a flat base lens hood. And what I like about this lens hood in particular is it is the focus distance of the lens. So if I get too close to a subject, this lens hood will at least stop it moving past that point of focus. So that's nice as well. What I also like about this lens hood in particular is it does have a little trap door here, which means I can swap out ND filters much more easily on this lens than other lenses. Unfortunately, none of these other lenses seem to have their own little trapdoor. Would have been nice to have that, but at least I've got it with the 90mm macro. Another thing that's also unique about the 90mm macro is it does also have a very smooth focus ring, which I do like. It is very important for macro photography to have those very slight adjustments in the focus, especially manual focus. But now for the cons of this lens, and of course every lens has its own shortcomings and the 90mm macro is no different. This lens here, its limitations would, I guess, be the 2.8 aperture. Some people might find that to be a bit of a disadvantage, a little bit too narrow for macro photography. but also, not low enough for low light photography or extreme low light photography. So really, you just can't win there, can you? And also, it doesn't have an inbuilt stabilization, which I would like to have in macro lenses, honestly, if they had a bit of stabilization. So look, I don't think any bug's gonna wait for me to set down a tripod, but again, it would be nice to have stabilization inside macro lenses. Next up is very much the all-rounder of the range, the 28-75 G2. And this is very much, I think, a lens that a lot of people will pick up if they're looking to get into the Tamron range, as it does sort of pick a very sort of safe focal range. So you can do your wide shots, but also a few sort of portrait shots as well. But no extreme telephotos when you're working with this lens right here. And you will also notice that it does have a G2 on the end. What that basically means is this is effectively a sequel to a previous lens, the 28-75mm. Think of it as like a follow-up to the GM2 Sony lenses, being a follow-up to, well, the GM1 lenses. But really what this lens here, what's different about it is it does have a sleeker and sexier design. It also has a glass molded lens on the front, so that helps to reduce any sort of aberrations and distortions inside this lens. And honestly, while this is said as a G2 lens, a lot of these lenses I do find have the consistent design across them. So these aren't necessarily sequels to other previous lenses, but this lens has just been, updated to sort of match this range right here. And in terms of the autofocus, it is the same with the 90mm macro. It's a VXD motor, so it's fast, it's silent, it's a reliable autofocus. Now, the aperture that you're working with here inside this lens, though, is a 9-blade aperture. So that's a step down from the 90mm macro, which is 12 blades, but still 9-blade aperture is, as far as this whole range is concerned, is about in the middle. But now let's talk about the cons of this lens. So for a lot of equivalents, they go down to 24mm. Fortunately, this lens only goes down to 28mm. That's not a huge loss to me, honestly, but for some people, it is going to be a bit of a problem. And as of this video, this is currently the widest Z-mount Tamron lens that you're getting at 28mm. From here on out, there is a lot more priority for the telephoto range. Next up is a great lens for your wildlife, your sports photography, and your general long-range photography, and that's the 50-400mm right here. For starters, this lens has an 8x zoom ratio, but it can also double up for a bit of macro photography at a 1:2 magnification. And also inside the lens, you do have a VC motor that does help with the stabilization of this lens. I would have liked to have seen this VC motor in all the lenses here, at least all the telephoto lenses, but unfortunately they have limited it to this and one other lens. But it's still good to have that stabilization, especially because honestly, I'm probably going to be hand-holding this baby here anyway. And the autofocus is pretty much the same as well. It's a VXD motor, fast and silent, and you do have GM glass elements inside this lens to help reduce aberrations. All in all, it's a pretty great lens. I mean, 50-400mm, so you're covering standard mid shots to, close-ups. That's a good range to be working with here. But as far as first-party equivalents are concerned, I do think it's worth mentioning, at least for this lens in particular, as it does get compared to a few first-party lenses in the Nikon range. Now, as far as equivalents do go, I do think this lens is closest to the Nikon Z 100-400mm, but that lens is twice the price and obviously more heavier. But realistically, this lens does get compared and weighed up against the 28-400mm Nikon Z. So the Nikon Z 28-400mm is very much a similar lens, but it's roughly around the same price, but it's also a lighter lens and obviously can go to a wider focal range. But it does have shortcomings in comparison to the Tamron. For starters, at 400mm, the Nikon Z 28-400mm, its maximum aperture is 8, whereas the Tamron right here is at 400mm is 6.3. So you're getting, a wider aperture with the Tamron, which, of course, lets in more light, which is going to matter as you do want to sort of, have your shutter speed fairly fast. So you want to let a bit more light in, and you are going to be a little bit more limited with the Nikon Z 28-400mm. So that's one thing to sort of weigh up. The glass inside these lenses are also fairly different. With the Nikon, you're getting 21 elements across 15 groups, and with the Tamron here, you're getting 24 elements across 18 groups. So that's probably why the Tamron's heavier, but it also means that the Tamron is catching a lot more and making a lot more corrections than you would get with the 28-400mm. In terms of cons with this lens, really the major con of this lens is something that's consistent across most of these lenses here. It is that plasticky sort of feel, but as I said earlier in the video, they have built this lens to be fairly durable and well protected against the elements, so not really a huge issue. Some people are probably going to want to have this mounted on a tripod anyway, but for some reason, it doesn't come with its own lens mount. The 150 to 400 does come with a lens mount and it does kind of fit on this lens here, but barely if I'm being honest. Now we're on to the true all-in-one of this range, the 35 to 150mm f2.8. So this lens is probably one of my favorite lenses of the range just because of that focal range. It's crazy, 35 to 150mm. Really bloody useful to have. It's also one of the first f2 all-in-one lenses. As far as focus distance is concerned, on the wider end, this lens can focus at 13 inches, so that's actually fairly close to your subject. This lens also does have a lot of the features consistent across the G2 or the higher end Tamron lenses. It does have a very sleek, sexy design. It's got a GM element inside to reduce distortion. It does have a VXT motor as well, fast and silent, so that's a good design. The focus ring is fairly smooth. There's no sort of stiffness there. One sort of setback in terms of the physical design though is unfortunately this, unlike previous lenses, isn't a 67mm diameter. It's an 82mm diameter. So you do have to invest in different ND filters for this lens, even if you've invested in other Tamron lenses. So that's a bit unfortunate. But another little thing I do like about the physical design though is it actually has up to 3 focus hold buttons around the lens. Most of these lenses either have 1 or no focus hold buttons at all. So that is something I like that they've put on this lens. I think this lens is very much a great all-rounder. Unfortunately, it doesn't have VC stabilization. I think that would have rounded this lens out nicely, but honestly, like I said, this is one of my favorite lenses of the bunch. If you're someone with a 2-camera setup, I do think this is a great lens as a secondary camera, as it does fill in most of the focal ranges and allows your other camera to sort of fill those very sort of niche focal ranges like 300 or 500. So cons of this lens, as I already said, it doesn't have any sort of in-body stabilization inside the lens, so that's a bit of a shame. And at 150, it's not hitting a extreme focal length. And another sort of thing is, well, honestly, it is a bit of a heavy lens. It is like feels like 1 kilo, so it is gonna weigh more than your standard sort of Nikon camera, at least my standard Nikon camera, the Z5. That's, I guess, a bit of a negative there, but honestly, if you're getting telephoto lenses, you're probably used to carrying around a fair amount of weight here. Really, I like this lens. It's still my favorite one of the bunch. All right, so now we're moving on from our wider ranges and going on to our telephoto ranges. So what we've got here is the 70 to 300mm RXD lens. And it's all right, but really this lens, I find this to be sort of a strange one among the bunch, as it does have an RXD motor, which is sort of a step down from the VXD. So it is a little bit slower, and honestly, there's nothing particularly special about this lens except what happens when you pick it up, which is, you notice, it's probably the lightest lens here at about 500 grams. So this is a very lightweight lens. A lot of the other lenses here can go up to 700 grams or over a kilo, which is heavy, but again, compared to other equivalent lenses, these are still fairly light lenses. But the 70 to 300mm here is definitely the lightest lens of the bunch, even compared to the 90mm macro or the 28 to 75. In terms of other shortcomings with this lens, outside of course, the slower motor, is it doesn't have any sort of focus hold buttons. It's got no GM glass like some of these other lenses do, so it's not reducing distortions on the same level as some of these other lenses. But also, it's only 7-bladed aperture, which is strange because a lot of these lenses either go to 9-bladed aperture or, in the 90mm macro's case, 12-bladed aperture. So it's a bit of a shame that there's a bit of a step down there. But really, if you're picking up this lens, it's sort of, one of its strengths is, of course, it is a very lightweight lens, but it's also a very inexpensive lens. Roughly, as of this video, it's a little over 700 AUD, so it's not an incredibly expensive lens if you want to get into telephoto photography on your Z-mount. Really, that's its advantages. It's lightweight and it's cheap. I do not understand why it's an RXD motor and not a VXD like the rest of them, but that's just the way it is. And now we're moving on to the finale, and this is the big one. This is the creme de la creme. This is the deluxe model. This is the 150 to 500mm from Tamron. So what makes this lens so special here? It is very much in a league above its own in comparison to these other lenses. Immediately upon picking it up, it does become apparent that this lens is not a plastic lens. It's a metal lens, so it's a lot more durable, a lot more solidly built, but it still does have that same level of protection as the other lenses here with the rubber gaskets. So, pretty good. It unfortunately does have an 82mm diameter as well, much like the 50 to 150. So yeah, do be prepared to invest in some ND filters for this lens in particular. Now, in terms of being compact, a lot of these lenses are compact lenses, I'd say. I wouldn't really say this is a compact lens. I mean, bloody look at it. But compared to other lenses within this focal range, it definitely is a compact. So it is nice to have an ultra telephoto lens here that is much smaller and can actually realistically fit into my backpack. So that's good to have. So in terms of the mechanics of this lens, they have thrown everything at it. Like for starters, in terms of the focal range, you only have to make very slight adjustments, about 75 degrees, to really change the focal range on this lens. So that's good to have. And if you are, of course, worried about accidentally changing the focal range on this lens, you can, of course, sort of slide it up. It will lock the focal range in place and you're safe. And for all you bird photographers, you'll be happy to know that they've also put a coating on the lens here, so you will have protection and reduction against flaring and ghosting. So if you want to point this lens at a bird in the sun, you won't have that flaring and ghosting, obviously. And you also do have the VC stabilization inside this lens, which I'm happy to see. You know, at 500 mil, I'd bloody expect it to have its own sort of stabilization. So that is nice to have. Unfortunately though, for the aperture is only 7 blades, so it's very much like the 70-300. It is limited in its aperture, but for some people that might be a bit of a win. Personally though, I always like more aperture blades around the bokeh, but that's just me. And in terms of focus, it does have the standard VXD motor, so you know, fast, silent, yada, 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 but it can also focus on a subject at its widest focal range at 23 inches. So that's fairly close as well, nice to have. Really, they've thrown a lot at this lens to sort of counter any issues you might get with this sort of focal range. So honestly, it's probably one of the most well-built lenses of this range, but of course, it is also the most expensive, so that's to be expected. But that's the entire Tamron Z mount range, and it's going to keep growing as of this video. Really, I don't expect them to release any sort of wide angle lenses anytime soon. It does seem like Tamron strongly favors their telephoto lenses and their macro lenses, so that's obviously going to be where their priorities are, clearly. But really, if you're looking to sort of get a telephoto lens that's lighter than the others, a little cheaper, but still has that quality aspect to it, this is a great range to sort of pick from. You do have some great sort of options here. Again, like my favorite is the 50-150, and you can't go wrong with the 150-500. Great sort of design here. There are a few that I'm a bit like so on, but honestly, it's a great range. You have everything you would need if you're a telephoto photographer, if you're a portrait photographer, and they do offer a little bit of versatility if you want to switch out to wider shots as well. Let me know what you think of the Tamron lenses. Would you get any? What's your particular favorites? Let me know in the comments below.